Too many. The AI revolution may have started out quite recently, but the amount of progress has been quite immense. It was not too long ago that people thought that self-driving cars were not going to be around till far in the future. Now we have several car companies looking into self-driving cars. They have systems like lane assist or almost entirely fully autonomous driving capability. But back in 1985, people believed that we would have flying cars way before we had self-driving cars. What they did not know is that the AI and computers themselves were already capable of such tasks. The AI revolution really started before 1985. Computers saw their use during the Second World War in 1944. They were used by the Allies to break the German code. Computers then had to be manually coded for every single program. So every time that you would want to try to guess a new different code the Germans were using, you would have to manually change each transistor. Almost directly after World War II, though, rocketry exploded. Both the United States and Russia both started experimenting with German-made rockets, like the V-2. Both of them adopted their own German scientists and went to the drawing board. As rocket designs began to get larger, however, as these rockets got larger, they started to reach higher altitudes where air was no longer enough to run over the fins and keep them stable. So instead of using manually trimmed fins to direct where the rocket went, they actually had to use computers to guide the rocket and point it where it needed to go to make manual adjustments. Now, because of the size of computers, rockets actually started using ground stations. What they did was they would have a very large computer station very close to the launch pad, and as these rockets went up into the air, they would get beamed information on how to adjust their course. Now, that's because transistors were quite large, but as transistors continued to get smaller, they eventually were able to fit on the rockets. An example of a rocket that needed to be beamed information from a ground station would be the Atlas. However, by the time that the Saturn V came around, transistors were quite small, and they were actually able to pack these transistors into a control ring. So these computers got small enough that they were able to control a massive rocket ship such as the Saturn V. This was the first instance of a self-guided system. Similar to how you would tell a car you want to go from point A to point B, a rocket had to say, I'm here, I need to know where I am so I can tell myself where to be. This was the beginning of AI, where it could control a vehicle and where it went. Transistors continued to shrink. No longer did they need to be strapped to a massive solid rocket booster in order to be considered light enough to fit in an aircraft. Now these transistors were small enough that they realized they could be put into aircraft. Now, the original aircraft that we had in the late World War, or early 60s, 50s, 60s were very early jets. You had the Comet or the Boeing 707, and then you also had the older propeller-driven aircraft, which all these aircraft had in similar. They had a flight engineer, and the purpose of the flight engineer was to specifically focus on running the engines. Now, because computers were able to get small enough, computers actually got rid of the need for this flight engineer. The flight engineer was no longer needed because the computer was smart enough to guess how to control the engines and keep that out of the need for the pilot to control. Now, this is great for the airlines because now they no longer need to hire someone to specifically stare at gauges for a 9-hour flight. However, what this brought up in mind for modern day pilot is that, well, if a computer can replace the flight engineer, eventually a computer can replace me. We already kind of see that today, where there are computer systems in specific aircraft that can land an airplane without any touching of a button. Many Airbuses have this, as well as a lot of private aircraft, where in a situation where the pilot would become unconscious, the plane would be able to detect that and land at the nearest safe location. However, there are flaws with this idea that eventually AI will replace pilots. The first reason is that the pilots do a lot more than we give them credit for. As a matter of fact, pilots, while they do let the AI control the plane, especially the autopilot when they're in climb and cruise, they actually do have to turn off autopilot very often, and that's because of situations where you would run into something like icing. Now, icing is a situation where ice forms on control surfaces of the plane. Now, the difference between AI and a human is a human can interpret the information and the feeling of the aircraft and determine that, yes, there is icing, and they can turn off the autopilot and manually take care of the situation themselves. The AI, however, that would be in the autopilot, doesn't know this. It can't tell the difference between flying in ice versus flying in normal weather. And what it would actually do is cause the plane to continuously pitch backwards until eventually it would fall and tumble to its death. This is actually a reason why you don't really see rockets launch on cloudy days, and that's because while yes, rockets are smart and they can get themselves where they need to go, they actually aren't smart enough to be programmed for every situation. Now, another situation where you would think that the AI would outdo another person is, what about just the landing? You said that the plane can land itself. And yes, that's true. Like I said, many Airbuses have the situation, Boeing's working on it, and a lot of private aircraft. However, a landing is not always guaranteed. As a matter of fact, very often, as pilots are trained, systems can fail. While planes are made to be especially redundant, systems do fail. And sometimes when a system fails, you can actually go off course by quite a bit, and you actually need to have visual sight of the runway in order to land. Now, AI are getting better at this, but it's not good enough to make the current class of pilots concerned about their jobs in the future. One of the last situations that would be concerning to modern day pilots is in emergency situations. Now, yes, a pilot becoming unconscious is a very big emergency situation, especially for an airline. However, the autopilot in a plane is way more basic and simple than we give it credit for. And yes, AI is getting better, but it can't be a creative thinker. It can't think outside the box. A situation would be the Alaska Airlines Flight 261. Now, this is a scenario that shows that pilots are thinking in ways that a computer could not have been programmed for. For example, the plane started to dive due to a failed elevator. And so as this dive was happening, the pilots realized that this elevator was stuck in this position, forcing the plane to dive. They realized, well, if the plane being upright is making it dive, if we roll it over upside down, then it'll climb again. Now, this specific situation did not work out, and sadly the plane was lost, but it's a good example of how pilots can think far outside the box than what a computer could. And I think with these situations where pilots are redundant, yes, and good companies know to remove redundant systems, but in the airlines that's not the case. Redundancy is good in the airlines, and the FAA forces that to be so. So this is why pilots really don't need to be too concerned about their current situation as a pilot. Now, there are systems in place right now where maybe pilots will no longer have a co-pilot. But that's okay, because while the computer can do the work of a co-pilot, the pilot is still there and responsible for getting the plane from point A to point B safely. It is not that autopilot or AI will replace pilots, but that they will learn to work together better and create a safer experience for air travel.